Benjamin Netanyahu has caved, for now. He was planning this weekend to destroy the so-called ceasefire and to renew Israel's genocidal frenzy against the Palestinian people in Gaza, but with an unprecedented intensity. We know this because Israel was deliberately violating the terms of the ceasefire agreement. Now, Israel wasn't just repeatedly shooting Palestinians dead in Gaza, as well as the West Bank, although you might consider firing at people to kill them qualifies as a violation of ceasing to fire. You might also conclude that if Hamas militants killed just one Israeli, let alone at least 25, there would be howls of outrage from the media and politicians, and Israel would immediately announce the ceasefire was over and unleash its firepower against Gaza again. When I say 25, I'm only talking about Gaza. I'm not talking about the vast numbers of Palestinians killed in the West Bank, including a pregnant woman and children. Now, if you believe all that would be the same standards applied, then you live in a parallel universe, because obviously the universe we live in, equal standards are not applied to Israel as to Palestinians or even close. More to the point, the ceasefire deal involved a massive upscaling of humanitarian aid. That was the agreement. The Israeli state has been relentlessly besieging the people of Gaza, which it made clear it would do from the very beginning. There was no subtlety. Yoav Gallant, former defense minister, is amongst those who announced a complete siege on Gaza on the grounds Israel was fighting human animals. That was the 9th of October 2023. Indeed, the main pillar of the arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court against Gallant, as well as that against the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, focuses on Israel's starvation policy towards Gaza. And then in northern Gaza, the so-called General's Plan was put into place. That was, of course, in the later part of last year. This was a grotesque plan devised by the retired Israeli General Gior Eiland, who served as an advisor to the former Defense Minister Gallant, to drive its entire civilian population out. That is, those who survived being bombed and shot, by using starvation and the siege of all the essentials of life. And of particular urgency in terms of humanitarian need required by Israel, which was in the agreement, is to do with shelter. It's estimated by the United Nations that 92% of homes in Gaza are destroyed or damaged. The vast majority of Gaza's population, of course, have been violently displaced. It's also worth noting that multiple Israeli news outlets made clear that Netanyahu was looking for an excuse to violate the ceasefire agreement in order to renew the onslaught. Al Jazeera went through the violations of the promises Israel had made as part of that ceasefire agreement.
Now around 12,000 aid trucks should have entered the Gaza Strip, meaning there's a shortfall of around 3,500. The agreement stipulated at least 50 fuel trucks should be allowed into the Strip every day, but on average, only 15 trucks have been allowed in daily. 200,000 tents were supposed to enter Gaza, but only 10%, that's 20,000, have made it in. And none of the 60,000 mobile homes promised have entered the Strip.
There was no explanation given for these violations. Israel was clearly just looking for an excuse to derail the ceasefire. So when Hamas then responded by saying the ceasefire had been violated and that the deal to release 3 Israeli hostages on Saturday would no longer happen, like clockwork, Donald Trump said all hell would break loose, which was echoed by Benjamin Netanyahu and his allies. But suddenly that changed. Suddenly Israel allowed those temporary homes into Gaza. And they not only allowed a surge in aid trucks to take place on Wednesday, they let in 801, which was 201 more than the agreement stipulated for that day, in order to retroactively make up for the lack of aid trucks on previous days. As the brilliant Dutch Palestinian analyst Mouin Rabbani, who I've interviewed on this channel, put it, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu caved. He also notes that Hamas was responding to Israel's refusal to engage in negotiations on the second stage of the 3-part January agreement, to new proposals put forward by Netanyahu that tried to comprehensively revise what had already been negotiated and concluded between the two parties, and that on top, of course, of Trump's plot to forcibly remove the Palestinian population, which, as Rabbani notes, renders the entire agreement meaningless and irrelevant. That's a crucial point. And an agreement for a lasting ceasefire makes no sense whatsoever if the actual plan is to force the entire civilian population out of Gaza. That's one way of getting a lasting ceasefire, of course, by simply getting rid of everyone. Now, Rabbani also notes that the media spin of what has happened is completely false. The media narrative was that the backlash against Hamas over 3 Israeli captives, hostages being released, looking gaunt and weakened is what caused Hamas to try and state that the ceasefire had been violated, because they feared what would happen if further hostages were released looking the same. That is, the resulting fury would provide an opportunity for Israel to renew its onslaught. Now, to be clear, as I always have been throughout, taking civilians hostage is a grave war crime. The point is, these claims for why the ceasefire was breaking down were false, and yet media outlets who had access to the facts spread disinformation. Indeed, let's hear from Guy Poran. He's a former captain in the Israel Defense Forces, so-called the Israeli Occupation Forces, who said on Israeli television that it was Israel, rather than Hamas, which violated the terms of the ceasefire deal.
Est-ce que vous pensez qu'il est temps de durcir le ton, comme l'a fait Donald Trump là hier?
Déjà, je suis pas d'accord, pas de tout avec ce qu'a dit le monsieur. On savait, tout le monde savait depuis beaucoup de mois, les situations des otages, tout le monde savait, on n'avait pas besoin d'avoir des images cette semaine. Président Biden, c'est lui qui a aidé l'Israël pendant toute la guerre, et Trump, il a le fait que c'est lui qui a pressé pour signer l'accord. Cet accord-là, il y a moins d'un mois, dans lequel il y a des étapes et tout est fait par les représentants de Trump. Et là, maintenant, tout au bout, il presse Israël de violer cet accord que lui-même a pressé de signer. Alors, ce président, c'est un fou. C'est tout ce qu'il dit pour les déportations, c'est exactement la même phrase qu'il dit pour annexer le Canada et le Greenland. Et, en même temps, c'est lui, avec Bibi, qui va tuer les otages qui restent là-bas.
Est-ce que ce n'est pas le Hamas qui viole l'accord avant?
Non, pas du tout.
Il n'y a pas de violation d'accord.
Non, pas du tout. Ça, c'est de pipeaux, c'est de bêtises. Le fait que même Israël d'avoir cette liste ça, c'est une excuse. Une excuse.
Astonishing stuff there, saying it's Trump and Netanyahu who want to kill the hostages. Indeed, the Times of Israel, of all outlets, had a headline which is very succinct and to the point. In first, Netanyahu spokesman admits no talks ongoing on truce's second phase in breach of deal. The question is, why has Israel caved and what happens next? It's worth noting that the polling shows that 70% of Israelis support the second phase of the hostage ceasefire deal. Before we get carried away here, a large majority also support Trump's proposal to ethnically cleanse Gaza, but clearly Israeli society wants to get their hostages back alive. If Netanyahu destroys the ceasefire, then those hostages will not return, and that could produce a massive backlash in Israeli society. It's also worth contemplating whether Trump, feeling jubilation, claiming to be securing a ceasefire in Ukraine, really wants that overshadowed with mass violence resuming in Palestine. However, all of this requires, I'm afraid, some very heavy caveats. Netanyahu has made clear over and over again he doesn't want a lasting ceasefire. He says he wants to continue the military onslaught until all of Hamas is destroyed. That's an impossible goal. As the former US Secretary of State Antony Blinken noted, after 15 months of genocidal mayhem and Gaza reduced to rubble, Hamas had recruited nearly as many militants as it had lost by January. This is, of course, inevitable. If you slaughter vast numbers of innocent people, some of their loved ones will always respond by desiring to fight back. Netanyahu's stated goal is impossible and by definition gives Israel's onslaught its genocidal character. We also know from multiple Israeli news reports that Netanyahu has no intention of completing the second phase of the ceasefire deal. Clearly, the calculation is to resume the onslaught when Israel has got back as many of its hostages as it can in order to diminish the backlash against Netanyahu from Israeli society. And that's why, I'm afraid, relief right now should be tempered by what is still likely to take place. For now, the respite for the Palestinian citizens of Gaza, who have so far survived one of the most heinous crimes of our age, will continue. We should not expect that to last. With the support of the most powerful man on the face of the earth, Israel is likely to resume its genocidal frenzy against the people of Gaza. Please like and subscribe, leave your thoughts and your comments. That's all good for the algorithm. Please help us expand our operations and reach new audiences across TikTok, Instagram, X, Facebook, you name it, at patreon.com/OJ34. I'll speak to you in a bit.